I always thought secrets were meant to stay hidden, but when my brother walked into my room that night, everything changed. His piercing gaze froze me in place, exposing the emotions I had buried for so long. What happened next shattered every boundary I thought I'd never cross, pulling us into a storm of forbidden desires that neither of us could deny. I never imagined my life would take this turn. Maya had always considered herself a grounded and practical woman. As the elder sibling, she prided herself on being the reliable one, always organized, always in control. Life in their small suburban home had been routine but comforting. Finn, her younger brother, had always been the carefree one, the family jokester who filled every room with his infectious laughter. Despite their occasional squabbles, their bond had always been unshakable, or so Maya thought. Returning home after a grueling work trip, Maya felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. The house was unusually quiet, with their parents away for the weekend. Finn's familiar strumming on his guitar drifted softly from the living room, a sound that had always been her background noise growing up. She smiled faintly, a wave of nostalgia washing over her as she unpacked in her childhood bedroom. The scent of lavender and old books surrounded her, an almost therapeutic contrast to the chaos of her recent days. But something felt different. Finn had changed in the months she'd been away. The boy she had left behind was now a man, taller, more confident, with a demeanor that carried an air of maturity she hadn't noticed before. His casual teasing still lingered, but it now came with a charm that unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. That evening, they shared a quiet dinner. Finn recounted stories from his recent gigs, his voice animated and his laughter contagious. Maya found herself drawn to him, not just as her sibling, but as someone unfamiliar and intriguing. It was disconcerting. She reminded herself that it was simply the fatigue playing tricks on her. As the night wore on, Maya retreated to her room, eager for rest. Yet, as she lay beneath the familiar warmth of her blankets, her thoughts kept circling back to Finn. His smile, his newfound confidence, the way his presence filled the room in a way that felt heavier than before. She tried to shake off the strange unease, attributing it to the stress and loneliness of her hectic life. Little did she know, these feelings would soon spiral into something she couldn't control. The days that followed Maya's return home were a blur of routine and subtle unease. She told herself repeatedly that the strange feelings lingering at the edge of her thoughts were nothing more than residual exhaustion. Yet, the cracks in her carefully constructed world began to show as she found herself noticing Finn in ways she never had before. It started with small things. Finn's playful banter carried a weight she couldn't quite place. His casual touch, a pat on her shoulder or a light brush of his hand against hers, lingered in her mind far longer than it should have. She dismissed it as harmless, but a part of her knew better. One evening, as Maya worked late in her room, she noticed Finn passing by her door more often than usual. He would glance in, offering her a teasing comment or a quick smile that sent a confusing flutter through her chest. It was nothing out of the ordinary, she told herself, but the growing warmth in her stomach begged to differ. The turning point came one quiet afternoon. Maya had been lounging on the couch, scrolling absent-mindedly through her phone, when Finn appeared in the doorway. His hair was tousled, and a mischievous grin played on his lips as he leaned against the frame. "You look like you're plotting something," she teased, trying to keep her tone light. He smirked, his gaze lingering on her just a beat too long. "Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm just trying to figure you out." His words hung in the air, laden with a meaning she couldn't quite decipher. She laughed nervously, brushing it off, but the intensity in his eyes was hard to ignore. Later that night, as Maya prepared for bed, she found herself staring into the mirror, questioning the thoughts that had been plaguing her. Why was she noticing the way Finn moved, the way his voice dipped when he spoke to her? Why did his presence feel so charged, so magnetic? It wasn't right. It couldn't be. But the more she tried to push the thoughts away, the more they consumed her. Finn's charm, his confidence, his sudden maturity, it all felt like a cruel trick her mind was playing on her. Every glance, every touch, every lingering moment between them seemed to pull her deeper into a web of emotions she didn't understand. That night, Maya lay awake, her heart pounding as fragments of their interactions replayed in her mind. She tried to rationalize her feelings, blaming the stress of her job, the loneliness of her life, anything but the possibility that her thoughts were veering into forbidden territory. But the truth was undeniable. There was something about Finn, something new, something dangerous. And no matter how hard she tried to convince herself otherwise, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that their relationship was shifting, inching closer to a line that should never be crossed. As the days passed, Maya became hyper-aware of Finn's every move. The way his laughter filled the room, the way his gaze seemed to linger on her when he thought she wasn't looking. The tension between them was palpable, a silent current that neither of them acknowledged but both could feel. And then came the moment that changed everything. It was late, the house quiet, and Maya had just stepped out of the shower when she found Finn waiting for her in the hallway. His expression was unreadable, his eyes searching hers as if trying to convey something unspoken. "Maya," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" She froze, her heart racing as the weight of his words settled over her. In that instant, Maya knew they were standing on the edge of something that could never be undone. The question was, would she step back, or fall? Maya stood frozen in the dim hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. Finn's eyes, usually so full of mischief, now held a depth she had never seen before. There was a vulnerability in his gaze, but beneath it lay something more potent, more dangerous, a spark of forbidden intent. "What's wrong, Finn?" Maya asked, her voice shaky as she tightened her robe around her. The dampness of her freshly showered hair clung to her neck, and the cool air seemed to amplify the heat rising in her cheeks. He hesitated, running a hand through his tousled hair. "Nothing's wrong," he murmured, stepping closer. I can't keep pretending everything's the same." Maya's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" she asked, though deep down, she feared she already knew. She clutched the edges of her robe, her fingers trembling as she willed herself to stay calm. Finn's gaze bore into hers, unflinching and intense. "You've noticed it too, haven't you?" he said softly. "The way things have changed between us?" Maya opened her mouth to protest, to dismiss his words, but no sound came out. Her mind raced, scrambling for an explanation, an excuse, anything to deny the truth that had been gnawing at her since she'd returned home. "I don't know what you're talking about," she managed to say, though her voice betrayed her. It wavered, shaky and unsure, as if even her own words didn't believe her. Finn stepped closer, his proximity overwhelming. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the clean, earthy smell of his skin. "You do," he whispered, his voice low and charged with emotion. "You feel it too." "I know you do." Maya shook her head, stepping back until her shoulders brushed against the wall. "Finn, this is crazy. You're my brother. This isn't right." He stopped, his expression softening as a hint of sadness crept into his eyes. "I know it's not," he said, his voice barely audible. "But that doesn't change how I feel. And I don't think it changes how you feel either." Maya's heart was racing, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She wanted to deny him, to push him away, to pretend that everything was normal. But as he stood there, vulnerable and exposed, she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him. The way her body reacted to his presence, the way her heart ached with longing she couldn't explain. "Finn, please," she whispered, her voice cracking as tears welled in her eyes. "This can't happen. It's wrong." He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The contact sent a jolt through her, a spark that ignited a fire she had been desperately trying to extinguish. "I know," he said, his voice trembling. "But I can't stop feeling this way. And I don't think you can either." Maya's resolve crumbled. The weight of her emotions, the intensity of Finn's gaze, the warmth of his touch, it was too much. Her tears spilled over, and she shook her head helplessly. "Finn, I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I'm so scared." He stepped closer, his hand moving to cup her cheek. "You don't have to be scared," he said softly. "We'll figure it out. Together." And then, before she could protest, before she could think, his lips were on hers. The kiss was soft at first, tentative and hesitant, as if he was testing the waters. But as Maya melted into him, as her own emotions took over, it deepened. His hands found her waist, pulling her closer, and she let herself be enveloped by the warmth of his embrace. Every part of her screamed that this was wrong, that they were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All she could feel was him. The way his lips moved against hers, the way his hands gripped her as if he was afraid to let go, the way her own body betrayed her, responding to him with a desperation she couldn't control. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and trembling, Maya stared up at Finn, her mind reeling. This changes everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he replied, his forehead resting against hers. "But I don't regret it." Maya closed her eyes, her heart aching with a mixture of guilt and longing. She knew they were standing on the edge of a precipice, that the path they were treading was dangerous and fraught with consequences. But as Finn's arms tightened around her, as his lips found hers again, she couldn't bring herself to pull away. In that moment, the world fell away. There was no right or wrong, no past or future, only the overwhelming, all-consuming connection between them. And as they gave in to the feelings they had tried so hard to deny, Maya knew there was no going back. The following days were a blur for Maya. Her emotions swung wildly between exhilaration and dread. The kiss, the moment that had broken every boundary, was seared into her mind, replaying in vivid detail whenever her thoughts strayed. Finn had been equally distant yet present, his gaze lingering on her longer than it should, his presence inescapable in their shared home. Maya tried to go about her days as if nothing had changed, but every interaction with Finn was charged with an energy she couldn't ignore. The way he leaned just a little closer when they talked, the way his hand would brush against hers as if by accident, the way his gaze softened whenever it met hers. It was all too much, yet not enough. It all came to a head one quiet evening. The house was still, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator as Maya stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at her cup of tea. She had been trying to distract herself, but her mind was a storm, and Finn was at its center. "Maya!" His voice broke the silence, and she jumped, the tea sloshing over the edge of her cup. She spun around to find him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What is it, Finn?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though her voice betrayed her unease. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped into the kitchen, closing the distance between them. "We need to talk," he said, his tone low and serious. Maya's heart raced. "About what?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Finn hesitated, his hands clenching at his sides. "About us. About what happened." "There is no us, Finn," Maya said quickly, her voice rising slightly. "What happened was a mistake. It should never have." "It wasn't a mistake," Finn interrupted, his voice firm. "You can't tell me you didn't feel it too." Maya opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. She had felt it. She still felt it. And that was what terrified her the most. "Finn, please," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't do this. It's not right." "Maybe it's not," he admitted, stepping closer. "But that doesn't mean I can just ignore how I feel. And I don't think you can either." Maya's resolve wavered as he closed the distance between them. His presence was overwhelming, his gaze piercing as it held hers. "Finn, we're siblings," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is wrong." He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "I know," he said softly. "But I can't stop. And I don't think you can either." Before Maya could respond, Finn leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was both desperate and tender. She froze for a moment, her mind screaming at her to push him away, to stop this madness. But her body betrayed her, melting into him as her hands found their way to his shoulders. The kiss deepened, and for a moment the world fell away. There was no right or wrong, no past or future. Only the overwhelming, all-consuming connection between them. Maya felt as if she were drowning, pulled under by a tide of emotions she couldn't control. But then a sound shattered the moment, a sharp, sudden knock at the front door. They broke apart, both breathing heavily, their eyes wide with panic. "Who could that be?" Maya whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. Finn didn't answer. Instead, he moved toward the door, his expression tense. Maya followed, her mind racing. As Finn opened the door, the last person Maya expected to see stood on the other side. It was their mother. "Mom!" Maya exclaimed, her voice higher than usual. "What are you doing here?" Their mother smiled, stepping inside. "I decided to come home early," she said cheerfully. "I missed you too." Maya felt the blood drain from her face as she glanced at Finn, who looked equally panicked. "You should have called," Maya said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We could have picked you up." "Oh, nonsense," their mother replied, waving her hand dismissively. "I wanted to surprise you." The tension in the room was suffocating as their mother moved past them, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Maya forced a smile, trying to act normal, but her heart was racing. She couldn't shake the fear that her mother would somehow sense what had happened, that she would see the guilt written all over their faces. As the evening wore on, the weight of their secret became unbearable. Every glance Finn threw her way, every accidental touch, felt like a spotlight shining on their transgression. Maya could barely breathe, her guilt and fear threatening to consume her. Later that night, as their mother retired to her room, Maya found herself alone with Finn in the living room. The silence between them was deafening, the air thick with unspoken words. "This can't happen again," Maya said finally, her voice shaking as she stared at the floor. We have to stop. Finn didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and filled with pain. Do you really think we can just forget about it? Pretend it didn't happen? We have to, Maya said, her eyes filling with tears. For Mom. For us. We can't destroy everything. Finn looked away, his jaw tightening. I don't know if I can do that, he admitted. I don't know if I can just turn this off. Maya's heart broke at his words, but she forced herself to stay firm. You have to, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Because if we don't, it'll destroy us. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them. Maya felt like she was drowning, trapped in a situation she didn't know how to escape. But deep down she knew Finn was right. This wasn't something they could just forget. The line they had crossed was too deep, the damage too profound. As the night wore on, Maya lay awake in her bed, her mind replaying the events of the past few days. She knew things would never be the same, that their relationship had been forever altered. And as she stared at the ceiling, tears streaming down her face, she wondered if they would ever find their way back. The days following their mother's return were a slow-moving nightmare for Maya. She couldn't look at Finn without her chest tightening, her thoughts spiraling into guilt and shame. Every shared glance felt loaded with meaning, every interaction a potential unmasking of their secret. Her mother, thankfully oblivious, went about her days with a cheerfulness that only amplified Maya's internal torment. Maya avoided Finn as much as possible, throwing herself into work and mundane tasks around the house. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the weight of what they had done. It clung to her like a shadow, a constant reminder of the boundary they had crossed. One evening, as Maya folded laundry in her room, Finn knocked on her door. Her heart sank as his familiar voice broke the silence. Maya, can we talk? She hesitated, her hands stilling over the fabric in her lap. There's nothing to talk about, Finn, she said, her voice barely audible. But he didn't take the hint. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside, closing it softly behind him. There's everything to talk about, he said, his tone insistent but not unkind. Maya looked up at him, her chest tightening at the sight of his pained expression. Finn, we can't keep doing this. Pretending nothing happened, pretending it's all fine. It's not. I know it's not, he said, sitting on the edge of her bed. But ignoring it isn't going to make it go away. She turned her gaze to the floor, tears welling in her eyes. I don't know what you want me to say, she whispered. I already hate myself for what happened. I can't. I don't hate you, Finn interrupted, his voice firm. I don't regret what happened. His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. How can you say that? Don't you realize what we've done? What it could do to our family? Finn ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. I know it's wrong, okay? I know it's messed up. But I can't change how I feel. And I don't think you can either. Maya shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. I can't do this, Finn. I can't live with this hanging over us. He reached out, his hand brushing hers. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through her even as she pulled away. We don't have to live like this, he said softly. We can figure it out. Together. Maya stood abruptly, moving to the window and staring out into the dark night. Figure what out, Finn? There's nothing to figure out. What happened was a mistake, and it can't happen again. We need to move on. Move on. Finn repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. Do you really think it's that easy? I don't know, she admitted, her voice breaking. But we have to try. The silence that followed was suffocating. Maya could feel Finn's gaze on her, but she couldn't bring herself to look at him. Her heart was breaking, torn between the undeniable connection they shared and the crushing weight of their reality. I don't want to lose you, Finn said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya closed her eyes, her tears falling freely. You already have, she said, her voice trembling. The moment we crossed that line, everything changed. We can't go back, Finn. We can't be the same. Finn stood, his footsteps soft as he approached her. I don't want things to go back to the way they were, he said, his voice filled with emotion. I want more. She turned to face him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his eyes. And what about me, Finn? What if I don't want more? What if I just want this to go away? His expression faltered, and for the first time, Maya saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Is that what you really want? He asked, his voice low and uncertain. She hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I don't know what I want, she admitted. All I know is that this isn't right, and it's tearing me apart. Finn's shoulders slumped, and he looked away, his jaw tightening. I guess that's my answer then, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. I'll stay out of your way. Maya watched as he turned and left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. She sank onto the bed, her body shaking with sobs as the reality of their situation settled over her like a suffocating weight. The days that followed were tense and unbearable. Finn kept his distance, and Maya threw herself even harder into work and routine, desperate for anything to distract her. But no matter how busy she kept herself, the memories lingered, the stolen moments, the heated kisses, the raw emotions that had pulled them together. Their mother began to notice the strain, her cheerful demeanor giving way to quiet concern. "Are you and Finn okay?" she asked one evening, her brow furrowed with worry. "You've both been so distant lately." Maya forced a smile, her stomach churning with guilt. "We're fine, Mom," she said quickly. "Just busy." But she wasn't fine, and she knew Finn wasn't either. They were both trapped, caught between the guilt of their actions and the emotions they couldn't seem to escape. And as Maya lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, she wondered if they would ever truly be free. Weeks turned into months, and the once intense tension between Maya and Finn slowly gave way to an uneasy silence. They avoided each other as much as possible, retreating into their own corners of the house. Their mother, oblivious to the turmoil that had unfolded, commented now and then about how distant they seemed. Maya forced smiles, offering vague excuses about stress and work, but inside, she felt like a hollow shell of the person she once was. One evening, Maya found herself sitting alone in the backyard, the crisp night air biting at her skin. The stars above shimmered against the inky black sky, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. She had spent countless nights replaying the events that had shattered her life. Every stolen moment, every lingering glance, every kiss that had ignited a fire she couldn't control. But those memories, once tinged with excitement and forbidden desire, now felt like chains weighing her down. The guilt had consumed her, carving out pieces of her soul until she no longer recognized herself. She had hurt not only herself but also Finn, someone she had sworn to protect, someone she should have never let herself see in such a way. As she stared at the stars, lost in her thoughts, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was Finn. His presence was unmistakable, a mix of comfort and tension that always seemed to linger between them. "Can I sit?" he asked quietly. Maya nodded, and Finn lowered himself onto the bench beside her. They sat in silence for a while, the cool breeze carrying with it a sense of finality that neither of them could ignore. "I've been thinking," Finn said finally, his voice breaking the stillness. "About everything." Maya swallowed hard, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "So have I." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. I want you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." Her heart clenched at his words. She turned to him, tears welling in her eyes. "It wasn't just you, Finn. I let it happen too. I'm just as much to blame." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I know, but that doesn't make it any easier." Maya took a deep breath, her chest tightening. "We can't keep living like this. It's destroying us." Finn looked up at her, his eyes filled with sadness. "So, what do we do?" "We move on," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We focus on the future, on rebuilding what we've lost. It won't be easy, but we have to try." He hesitated, then nodded. "You're right. It's the only way." The silence between them was heavy, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the suffocating tension that had plagued them for months. It was the quiet understanding of two people who had finally reached the same conclusion. "I'll always care about you, Maya," Finn said softly. "But we have to let this go." Maya's tears spilled over, and she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know." As they sat there, side by side, the stars above seemed to burn brighter, as if offering them a sliver of hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, Maya felt a sense of clarity. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, that the scars of their actions would never fully fade. But she also knew that healing was possible, even if it took time. In the weeks that followed, Maya and Finn began to rebuild their lives, piece by fragile piece. They focused on their individual goals, finding solace in their own paths while maintaining a respectful distance. Their relationship, once tainted by forbidden desires, began to shift into something healthier, something grounded in mutual understanding and forgiveness. Maya learned to forgive herself, though it was a slow and painful process. She threw herself into her work, finding purpose in helping others and building a future she could be proud of. Finn, too, found his own way, channeling his energy into his music and forging new connections outside the walls of their home. Though the memories of what had happened lingered, they no longer defined them. They were reminders of the mistakes they had made, yes, but also of the strength it took to overcome them. And in that, Maya found her moral takeaway. That even in the face of profound regret, it is possible to choose a different path, to build something better out of the wreckage. The scars would remain, but so would the lessons. And as Maya stood at the threshold of her new life, she finally felt ready to take the first step forward. If you were in Maya's position, could you have made the same choice to walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories that dive into the complexities of forbidden love, heartbreak, and redemption. Stay tuned for our next story. You won't believe what happens when secrets come to light.